Lately, I've been really interested in consciousness, not just what it is and what it has enabled humans to do, but where it came from. Last week, I got into a conversation with somebody on YouTube. It was actually a good conversation about consciousness, and we tried to kind of address this question. Is consciousness a product of the brain? Their perspective was that consciousness and the brain are two inseparable things that work together to give us this human experience. However, I disagreed with them. I do believe that consciousness is a product of the brain and the brain's functions. One of the main reasons they disagreed with me was because what I was trying to prove only proved correlation and not causation. So we're going to start off this video with a short discussion of correlation and causation. So one of the main things we need to know, and you've heard it before, is correlation does not imply causation. And I'll give you an example. People who eat ice cream cones are more likely to die drowning. Now, there's a correlation between those two variables, eating ice cream cones and drowning. But that doesn't imply that eating ice cream cones is what's causing people to drown. Now, if you're interested, the actual reason that there's a correlation here is because during the summer months, people are more likely to eat ice cream cones and also go to the beach. And those two things are correlated with each other. And so drowning also ends up being correlated with eating ice cream cones. So let's bring this over to brain studies. The reality is when scientists do brain studies, they're most likely going to come up with a correlation, not a causation relationship. One example is testosterone. Testosterone is correlated with impulsive behavior and violence, but doesn't cause that behavior. You can have very high testosterone levels and be super chill. The same kind of reasoning can be applied to hyperactive regions of the brain. So the chances are, if you have a hyperactive amygdala, you will have more impulsive behavior. There's a correlation there, but there's not a direct causation relationship. In a previous video on this channel, I talked about hyperactive brain regions and the role that they play in looking at criminal behavior. My conclusion was that the hyperactive regions of the brain do not cause any behavior. The criminal still had ultimate control. So rather than a causal relationship between our conscious experience and our brain activity, it seems like we're starting to see more of a correlation instead. However, there are three lines of evidence that really prove a causation relationship between our consciousness and our brain. The first one is split brain procedures. After every single procedure, the patient will have one blind eye but not be consciously aware of it. In other words, they will notice no difference between their vision prior to the procedure and after it. This is a fundamental change in their conscious experience that has a causal relationship with the split brain procedure, the physical changing, the physical severing of the brain. What's interesting in this situation is that the eyeball is actually still taking in information, but the brain is just not receiving it. Furthermore, with these split brain procedures, sometimes areas are cut and predictable things happen. For example, in one procedure, the area connecting the recognition center with the emotion center was severed. And as a result, when the patient saw his own father, he could recognize him, but didn't believe that it was him because he had no emotional response. The patient insisted this guy in the waiting room was actually an imposter and not his real father. What we have here is a direct causation relationship between the severed area of the brain and the conscious response of the patient. The next line of evidence I want to talk about is diseases like Alzheimer's that affect the brain. Early stages of Alzheimer's actually affect the learning portion of our brain, and it makes it extremely difficult to retain newly learned information. This is something that is repeatable, this is something that's consistent and predictable, and suggests a causation relationship rather than a correlation. The next line of evidence I want to mention is coming from a book that I'm currently reading called Evolving Brains, Emerging Gods. In this book, the author expands on the evolution of the brain, the evolution of our conscious experience, and the evolution of religion and its formation. What I want to note from this book and how I think that it proves a more causation relationship between consciousness and the brain is that we've had consciousness for a very long time, and there's been a clear evolution of it through the past few million years. Also, humans are not the only organism that has consciousness. Consciousness is something that's actually pretty widespread. Now, of course, we have a different level of consciousness, and it's much higher than any organism that we know of. But nobody argues that, the rat's consciousness has been given to him by a creator, or that his conscious brain is kind of part material, but also part transcendent. So really the big question, the question I think really takes down the argument presented in this YouTube comment that talked about the brain and consciousness being two separate, kind of distinct, but inseparable things that come together to form this experience that we have. And the biggest thing against that, and the biggest question, the biggest objection would be, when did that happen? When did this mystical version of consciousness come into the human animal and give us the experience that we have today? It seems much more rational that consciousness has slowly evolved as we can look back and see, and that consciousness is not something that is from outside of the universe or something that's outside of even our body. I really believe that the evidence shows consciousness is a product of our material brain. Thank you for watching this video. If you're interested in consciousness, where it came from, what it is, I have a video right here that actually talks a little bit about that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.